Okay. All right, so that was a great introduction. Thank you. I don't need to tell you all who I am, but yeah, I'm Abby. This is a lovely picture of where I work. It does not look like this at this time of year, but it looked quite nice in the spring. So let's just. So that just repeats the title and tells you who I am. And this whole kind of overall project is called the Tools for Schools project. And within that, I'm developing this toolkit, which we're calling the Flex Toolkit. And I'm going to tell you today about how I've gone about developing that and show you some screenshots as well of the toolkit. So I'm part of CHIME in Exeter, which is the Children and Young People's Mental Health Research Collaboration. And my project that I'm talking about today is funded by NIHR. It's actually an advanced fellowship for 5 years, and I'm about halfway through that now. So what is ADHD for people who don't know? It's when you have impairing levels of these kind of cluster of 3 different traits. So inattention, impulsivity, or hyperactivity. And the interesting thing is that the recognition of difficulty often happens in primary school. So to assess ADHD and accurately diagnose it, it can take years. And I quite often hear from families that do now have a diagnosis of ADHD that their child was initially diagnosed with something else like autism. And yeah, it's a difficult thing to recognize. And not everyone that has traits of ADHD needs a diagnosis as well. It's only when it's really impairing. The other thing to know about ADHD is it's highly genetically kind of linked and very heritable, but it's not like there's 1 or 2 simple genes that cause ADHD. It's what we call a polygenic disorder. So there's lots and lots of small genetic effects that kind of add up to you having high levels of 1 or 2 or 3 of these traits. So I like to think of the symptoms of ADHD as kind of a really unlucky combination of personality traits. And we know that personality traits are really complicated things, right? And everyone's got some sort of level of inattention. Everyone's able to concentrate a certain amount, and some people are naturally better at that than others. And when you have ADHD, or if you meet criteria for ADHD, you've just got kind of the unlucky end where it's actually causing you problems in day-to-day life. So it looks different and causes different impairments depending on the child. And as I just said, it's traits rather than a dichotomous kind of yes or no, you have this disorder. So where do primary schools come into this then? Well, quite often ADHD or the difficulties associated with it are first recognised in primary school. So it might be a parent realises when their child starts school that their child is actually very different to most of the other children. Or it could be a teacher, teaching assistant, or the special educational needs coordinator who first recognises that there's a challenge. That recognition and kind of management of ADHD in schools is influenced by the expertise and beliefs of school staff around what the cause of the problem is. And I've done some qualitative research around that, which I'm happy to share with you. Schools also advise on whether or not families should seek referral or assessment for specific problems like ADHD, or go ahead with looking for a diagnosis. And then, of course, they manage and support the child through the process. So getting a diagnosis of ADHD can take years, and the waiting lists at the moment are really, really long. And it's not like a child just stops and, holds on for that to happen. Life continues often for several years, and quite a lot of their primary school time potentially. And schools also inform clinicians who might be making a diagnosis or assessment about the child's symptoms. So primary schools often provide additional support for these children, whether or not they have a diagnosis or medication. If you're struggling in school and you need support, your school normally recognises that and tries to do their best by you. But they're really constrained by the resources they have. So we see a lot in the news at the moment about the lack of money and time that schools have, the lack of staff, and it's really difficult to then focus on one individual child's needs when you're trying to deal with a class of 30 children and you're on your own with them all day. For children that have ADHD, the sad reality is that as they go through school, there's quite often conflict and increasingly negative relationships between home and school, because school is a difficult place. Home is sometimes a difficult place as well. And if you're constantly being told negative things about one or the other, it doesn't help relationships. So as children with ADHD become teenagers, or even in primary school, it's quite common that they would be excluded from school or suspended. And quite often a child will go through several primary schools or several different schools by the time they get to kind of 16 or 18 years old. So I did some work a while ago looking at what school staff report that they do to manage ADHD. And what teachers have told me is it's more of a reactive process than a proactive process. So what they do is they think, this child that I'm working with today is having this problem. So what I'll do is I'll think about what I know helps and I'll try out these different solutions until I find something that works with them. And then I'll keep doing that until it no longer works. And what schools really struggle with is that most of the ways that we know how to manage behaviour don't really work for children with ADHD, and particularly if ADHD is combined with something like autism or demand avoidance. So why am I here? Why am I developing a toolkit? Well, the problem with existing studies of kind of school-based interventions for ADHD is they kind of throw everything but the kitchen sink at the child. They go, okay, let's do social skills training. Let's help you with your organization. We'll do a parent group at weekends. We'll get the teachers to do this. And so they throw kind of 8 or 10 different interventions at the child at once, hoping that one of them will work. And that means that we don't know what's working for who. So this is a really expensive thing to do if you're doing kind of 10 different interventions at once, and they're quite often delivered by therapists in most research studies. It's not clear what's working for who. It's really unclear as well what actually happens in terms of, is it the shorter reactive things that are most helpful, or is it the long sustained programs that are more helpful for children? There's very little evidence that we can maintain any kind of positive effect, and it's really hard to measure those effects. So this is a problem when it comes to kind of commissioning and recommending treatments for ADHD, because it's quite easy by comparison to do a drug trial because you can blind your participants so people don't know if they're getting the actual medication or a placebo. And then you can have people observe children who don't know what treatment they've had. And that means you get a nice high quality of evidence about whether or not your treatment works. Whereas when you're doing interventions in schools, the teacher knows that there's an intervention, the child notices something different happening, and it's really difficult to then have any kind of objective measure of whether or not these things are helping. So at the moment, even though there's over 50 trials of different interventions, there isn't a strong evidence base. And these things that do exist are just not implemented in schools because we don't have therapists on call all the time. So the solution that I'm proposing is that we develop this toolkit of intervention strategies. So we take the bits that we know work from other research and from talking to families and looking at theory, and then we deliver just the tools that individual children need to that child. So that's where the individualized bit comes in. So, oh, here we go. Here's a picture of my team. So Susie, these things don't happen in isolation. So I have a really big advisory group of academics, as well as my own research team who are helping me do this toolkit and test it out in primary schools. So, like I said at the start, I've been funded for 5 years to do this program of work. And what I'm overall trying to achieve is developing an acceptable and feasible intervention for ADHD in primary schools that we can further evaluate in a trial. So it's really kind of developing a prototype and checking that it's acceptable for schools to use and that it's not causing teachers a huge burden, and it's something that could actually be picked up and used in the future. It's a small study, it's a feasibility study, which means that at this stage we can't prove for sure that this toolkit would definitely improve things for all children with ADHD, but we can start to work out what we would measure and how we would measure that to look at that in a much bigger group of children after this study. So I have several main aims. One of them is to develop this prototype, which is going to be finished next week, so I can show you some screenshots of that. Then we're going to refine it so that we know that it's feasible and acceptable for schools to implement. And the way that we're going to do that is by trying it out in 8 primary schools, but in a staggered way. So we've got 2 schools trying the toolkit next term. And then the following term, we have a 3rd school try. And then in the autumn, we have 2 more schools try it. And every time we get feedback from a school, we're going to incorporate that into the design of the toolkit. So by the end of the 5 years, we should know whether or not we can do a definitive trial, so a randomized control trial, to show that it is effective for improving symptoms of ADHD or functioning at school. So that's quite a lot of sciencey stuff, but I like to make things a bit more simple. So this poster kind of outlines the whole 5-year program of work that I'm doing. And you'll see that I'm now kind of coming up to phase 2. I'm overlapping between phase 1 and 2. So I've done a huge evidence synthesis to look for the outcomes, or look at what the best evidence is for the outcomes that the toolkit is going to target. And we've developed the prototype as well. And you can see this list of different outcomes here. And actually, Rasheen, who is hosting this seminar, did her dissertation with me when she was an undergraduate student, and she did a Delphi survey to find out what outcomes were most important to these families and school staff. So that's why the toolkit is targeting these things. And then we're doing that study in 8 primary schools over the next few years. So we're just recruiting our last schools now to take part. And the other thing that I haven't really mentioned so far is that the toolkit is being entirely co-created with real people who actually are involved in these situations all the time. So I have a group of about 25 people. So they're adults with ADHD or parents with children with ADHD. I've got a range of school staff, and then I've got some educational psychologists and a child and adolescent mental health registrar as well. I think they're a psychiatry trainee. So I'm doing all of this with them. So in the developing stage, what I'm going to do is tell you how I made the toolkit, and then I'm going to kind of show you a bit about what it looks like now, and then I'll tell you how I'm testing it in schools. But I co-created it, like I just said, here we go, with my planning group. And that's been really, really important all along the way. So I'll do a bit of work and I'll take it to my planning group and I'll say, okay, here's what I've come up with. What do you think? What should I change? And I do that every kind of 3 or 4 months. So for 2.5 years now, I've had a huge amount of input into the toolkit. And then we developed a logic model. So what do we think it is that the intervention needs to target? And we've called it Flex because it's all about adapting around the child rather than trying to change the child themselves. So what we want to do is understand the child and what their communications mean, then adapt the classroom and the expectations of the school, support the child to reduce acute or short-term impairments, to increase their skills and hopefully improve their self-esteem. The result of all of that would hopefully be that the child is able to be more conscious about their kind of emotions and behavior and start to self-regulate. And then we want to sustain that and adapt it across time, because children aren't things that just are static and never change. They're always changing and new problems come up. So we've got 6 different modules in the toolkit. And like I said, when I was describing about kind of not throwing everything at every child, we're only going to use 2 modules with each child, depending on what the main problems they're having at the moment are. So this is where some of the individualization comes in. So we've got one called Channeling Energy, which is about hyperactivity. Got one called Pausing for Thought, which is about impulsivity. Paying attention and engaging is about attention. Belonging and relating is about relationships with peers and with school staff. Organizing, planning and reminding is more about organization skills, but also some kind of executive functioning skills. And then we've got Feeling Good, which is all about self-esteem. So the research or scientific method that I've used to develop the toolkit is something called intervention mapping, and this is based on behavior change theory. So what you do with intervention mapping is you basically work out what are the most basic behavioral steps that everyone needs to achieve to make this change happen. So you start off by making a logic model of what the problem is. So what's the worst case scenario for a child with ADHD in school? What are the worst things that their parents are doing that make it worse? What are the worst things that teachers could be doing? And what does that look like for the child and their outcomes? Then you do the opposite. You model what does brilliantly supported ADHD look like in a primary school? What's everyone doing that makes that support work? And what are the better outcomes for the child? And then the crucial bit, which is where the intervention comes in, is that you model the change to get from the problem to the solution. So if you are all doing the worst case scenario, what is it exactly that you would need to change in your behavior to get to that better scenario? So normally that's about learning new skills or kind of changing attitudes or beliefs or expectations or providing knowledge. And then we derive what the intervention mapping approach calls performance objectives, which are really like the smallest steps of behavior that we need to get people to do to change. So maybe it's that a teacher knows how to use a worksheet to support a child to do a particular task. So they're really, really small steps of behavior. Then we look to understand what the determinants of that behavior are. So like I was just saying, is it that people need to acquire new skills? Is it that they need knowledge, or is it a change of attitudes or beliefs that we might need to get people kind of taking part in? And once we've figured this out, we can map those to things that we know help people change that behavior or change an attitude or change a belief. And we've all actually seen quite a lot of this during the pandemic in terms of kind of public health messaging, and the way that different organizations and kind of governments are using kind of public health messaging to try and get people to wear masks or to wash their hands more, and the different kind of messaging they used. It's all informed by these kind of behavior change methods. And I will show you an example of this as well. So the thing about intervention mapping is it sounds quite like complicated, but there's a very clear process that you follow when you're doing it. But it's one of those things where you start off with like, okay, I want a toolkit for kids with ADHD in primary school. It sounds really straightforward. And then it just explodes into this hugely complicated thing where you've got hundreds and hundreds of lists of hundreds of behaviors. And then you kind of distill it back down again and you go, okay, well, all of these things could be changed if one person acquired this one skill. So I thought what I would do is show you a picture of this, which might be the next slide. But yeah, we design our intervention components in line with the behavior change methods. Here we go. Here's a terrifying logic model, and I do not expect you to read this at all. But this is one section of that logic model of change in terms of who needs to change what in order to improve different outcomes for children with ADHD. So I thought I'd just work through one example of a strategy. So in my toolkit, we've got these 6 modules, and all the modules have multiple strategies in them where we're changing different behaviors, and teachers will get to choose which strategies they want to use. They can browse through them and think, oh, you know, I do that all the time, I don't need that one. Or they might think, oh yeah, I'll give that one a go. So this one's from the pausing for thought module. And the behavior that we want to achieve in the end is that the child is able to wait for their turn to speak in a different range of situations. And then we thought, okay, so that's probably got something to do with knowledge, something to do with their beliefs or attitudes, and also their skills. So then we go and we look at behavior change methods that we know improve knowledge. Oops, sorry. So things like shifting perspectives or anticipating regret or self-reevaluation. So anticipated regret is an interesting one. It's kind of thinking about, you know, how would you feel if you shouted out and somebody else didn't get a chance to speak, and getting someone to think, oh, actually, I'd feel bad about that. And then in terms of methods to change beliefs or attitudes, you've got things like implementation intentions, which is thinking through what you're going to do in advance. Planning coping responses. So if you do shout out and you feel bad about it, how can you cope with that? Do you have a plan in place? And mobilizing social support, so getting everyone else in the class to help out as well. Then we have methods to increase skills. So things like guided practice, which means practicing something, but with someone else helping you and structuring that. Inactive mastery is where you do something more and more and you become more skilled at it. And then self-monitoring of behavior is about being aware of what you're doing and starting to be able to monitor when you're doing it. So based on these kind of methods that we know might work and might help, then we're coming up with an idea for a strategy. So the strategy we've got here is called turn taking. And we've designed most of these so that they are group or classroom-based activities that could be done individually with a child, but they could be done with the whole class. So this is a game that then gets applied in lessons. So there's an activity for the class to do, which is kind of what's good about people who share and take turns. The teachers kind of walked through how they already facilitate turn taking in the classroom and how they make sure that everyone gets a turn to speak. There's an activity for the class to do around what's good about people who do and don't wait their turn. And then there's a game which turns out great if people take their turns in turn, and it turns out wrong if people don't. So I think the best way to explain this is, I don't know if you guys have played that game where you fold a piece of paper into 4 and then you draw in the top, you know, the first person draws the head of a monster and then they fold it over, and the next person draws like the shoulders and the body of a monster and they fold that over, and then the next person draws the legs, and the final person draws the feet, and then you unfold it and you've got like a really silly looking monster. Well, if you do that and you don't take it in turns, then you might end up with a head and then some feet and then some arms and then some legs. So it's a game like that where if you do it right, it all works out. And if you don't, then it's hilariously wrong, but wrong nonetheless. So it's all quite lighthearted. And then there's kind of a self-monitoring aspect as well. So having something physical in the classroom that you're holding when it's your turn to speak or contribute. So what we've done is we've turned these into kind of instructions for teachers, written in the way that teachers currently plan and use things. So all the instructions have like a plan section, and then a do section, and then assess whether it's worked, and then review it. And we make them all the resources they need to put this into practice in the classroom as well. So this is my kind of overall logic model, which I thought would be interesting to include just to give you an idea of the different components of the toolkit. So these are all the kind of key things that we think we need to change to get from that worst case scenario of badly supported ADHD to the best case scenario where a child is really supported to thrive. Excuse me. So we've got kind of increasing knowledge of ADHD and neurodivergence and promoting a collaborative homeschool relationship. Then we want to share that knowledge and expertise between home and school and also other staff within the school. We've got understanding the child within their context and appreciating their individuality. And we think in order to achieve that, we need to kind of promote a flexible and inclusive school culture as well. So we want to build skills and capacity of the school and the teachers and the child to manage those acute impairments. And to do this, we need to adapt the environment so that they can engage better in school. And then thinking slightly longer term, we want to facilitate self-monitoring and self-regulation so that the child can start to manage their own behaviour. And we're hoping that all of this would build self-esteem, reduce the core symptoms, and improve inclusion and relationships. So this is the basic outline of the Flex toolkit. So we have psychoeducation training for staff and parents, which is knowing about ADHD. And the toolkit's for children who have traits of ADHD or a diagnosis. They don't have to be diagnosed. Then there's an activity about knowing the child called Know Me, which is all about understanding their verbal and nonverbal communications and what that means for them. And then also understanding their interests and hobbies and what engages them so that we can tailor things more towards what they're likely to engage with. Then we've got understanding motivations and developing targets. And that's where home and school are working together to think, okay, what are the two biggest barriers to them doing well at school at the moment? What behaviors do we want this toolkit to change? And then breaking those down into really small achievable goals that they could hopefully get to over the course of one school term. So depending on what these goals are, they map to those different modules in the toolkit, and then the teacher and the SENCO can choose what strategies they try. Alongside this, there's a digital school home notebook, because some of the best evidence for school-based ADHD interventions is actually that regular positive communication between home and school is a really positive outcome for children. And then we're just kind of implementing these strategies or seeing what teachers do with them. We're not getting that involved, reviewing that, tracking progress over the term, and then feeding that back. So up until last week, I could not have shown you the prototype of the toolkit, but it's very nearly finished now. So it's a digital website. This is what it looks like. And different staff and families will have different logins. So if you're a SENCO, you would be able to see the students in your school that you're using the toolkit with. If you're parents, you would just see your own child's toolkit, and the teacher would just see the toolkit for the child or children in their class who are taking part. So this is kind of the homepage for it. And we've also got this thing called a resources bank. So if you're not part of the research study, but you want to use the toolkit, you can actually access all the modules and strategies and resources yourself for free, but you can't log in and use the interactive functions yet. So yeah, so this is what it looks like. You've got kind of buttons for the Know Traits of ADHD activity. There's a whole school inclusion challenge, which is where the senior leadership team are kind of challenged to do things. That school home notebook, and also some posters and printables. This is just one of the PDFs we've made for the inclusion challenge, which is about senior leadership thinking, what could we change in terms of school policies and procedures that might better support children with ADHD? I'm quite happy to talk about that more during questions. This is a bit from the no ADHD section. So there's kind of different questions and answers, and then really short learning snippets. So kind of 3 or 4 minute videos on YouTube, which I had to record last week, which I wasn't very pleased about because I hate seeing myself on the screen. But that's not the point of it. So yeah, we've got different learning snippets about the different kind of aspects of ADHD and the causes of them. And then this is a screenshot of the page once you're in a child's toolkit. So this is Harry Potter's toolkit as the example. And you can see you can get you can decide on your goals and targets. There's a page where you can record the Know Me activity findings, and kind of home and school can both put in their perspectives, and then they can each see what the other has said, you know, what Harry likes to do and what he doesn't like to do, and how he behaves when he's happy or sad or excited. And then you've got these different modules or strategies that you can activate for Harry. So then you can go straight into them and get those instructions. We've got a button where you kind of keep your targets listed, and you can set dates that you can review them by as well. And then when we're collecting data from the teachers for the research study, we're actually turning that into graphs so that teachers can look and see how their child has been progressing over time. And we've done that specifically because teachers asked us to do that. And this is one of the module home pages. So this is the belonging and relating module. And this is some of the strategies that we've got in there. So each one has a short description of what it is so that teachers can kind of browse through and think about which ones they might want to read in more detail. And then this is what one of the strategy page instructions looks like. So you've got your key points. You've got kind of what you need to do to plan to do it, what you actually need to do in class with the students, and then how to assess and review that. And then underneath, we have all these downloadable resources. So everything in italics here, we provide some sort of worksheet or lesson plan or activity that they can use. So here's an example of one of those. So this is a problem solving template. So we're trying to encourage teachers to use more positive feedback with children. So we have a game called Pick Up the Positives, which they play with their class, where they kind of praise different children for doing different things and learn to use specific labeled praise. And this is kind of, once they've reflected on how it's going, if they're having any problems, this is a template to try and help them think through what is it that they're having a problem with and what could they do differently. Okay, I'm just going to have some water for a second, and then I'll tell you how we're going to refine this prototype. I think my voice is probably so hoarse because of all the videos I've been recording this week for the toolkit. But yeah, so at the moment, we've got what we call an alpha version of this prototype. So we've got something that functions that school staff can use, and they're going to start using it in January. But like I was saying earlier, the purpose of the whole study is to make sure that it's feasible and acceptable for primary schools generally. So I don't think that what I've currently got is going to be perfect for schools. So what I want to know is, what is it that we need to change before we could evaluate it on a much larger scale? So this is where refining comes in. So we have a feasibility study going on, which is a research study where we're looking at how acceptable the toolkit is and collecting some information on what's happening for the children that we're using the toolkit with. So we've got 8 primary schools, and each of them have nominated a mental health lead, which is normally the SENCO. And they're the person who's coordinating using the toolkit. So they help us decide which children we should recruit, and they liaise with the teachers and support the teachers and teaching assistants to actually use the toolkit and the strategies. We also recruit parents and families, and they get to access the toolkit from home and be a really kind of important part of it if they want to be, but they don't have to engage with it. And then it gets used with the children. And like I was saying, most of the strategies are kind of whole class approaches, but they're targeting specific things for these specific children. So this shows you where we are. And I said earlier, we're kind of doing this in a staggered way. So the green blobs are when different schools in the study are using the toolkit. And we'll take their feedback every time they use it. And then if we need to make changes before the next school tries it, we'll do that. So we have one term before that where we're finding out what's normal for the child in school. So at the moment, we're tracking 8 children in the first 2 primary schools, looking at their symptoms of ADHD every 2 weeks over the past 2 weeks, and then also kind of how they're functioning in school. And when they're using the toolkit, we'll be doing some more detailed tracking. And then in the term afterwards, we're not going to take the toolkit away from schools, but they might stop using it. And we're going to follow up with them and find out what went well and what didn't, and see if there's kind of any changes in behaviour that happen during the green term that then kind of dissipate in the yellow term, or whether there's any benefits that are sustained. So hopefully by the time we get to kind of autumn 2024, we'll have something that we know is acceptable for primary schools to use in their everyday practice. So where are we with this at the moment? We've got 7 of the 8 schools recruited, and I'm kind of gently prodding my Senko in school number 8 to see if they definitely want to take part. But this is the first time I've done a research study where I've had more schools volunteer to take part than I can actually involve. So I have 2 schools on a waiting list at the moment as well. We've got 8 children and 7 teachers and 2 teaching assistants. So we've got 7 teachers because it's really important to allow people not to participate if they don't want to take part in the research. And obviously collecting all this information for us as well as using the toolkit could be quite a burden for teachers. So if a teacher doesn't want to take part, but there's a child in their class who's taking part, then we try and recruit a teaching assistant instead. We're just recruiting our children now in school number 3. So tomorrow I'm off to that school to talk to their teachers and get them to sign up. And yeah, that's where we're at with the study. So I've mentioned a few different things that we're measuring. And like I say, because we're changing the toolkit between different schools, we can't really prove that it's effective for improving symptoms of ADHD, but we can definitely collect some data and see what happens on an individual level and whether those effects are replicated across the 32 children in the study. One of the things with my fellowship that was quite hotly debated when I was applying for funding was what's the most important primary outcome? So what's the thing that we think is most important to change for these children or families or schools? And I got into a few debates with people because some people felt very strongly that ADHD symptoms should be the thing that we're targeting most, whereas others felt it was more about classroom functioning, so how you're getting on at school in a more general way, regardless of what the ADHD symptoms are. So we're tracking both of those things every 2 or 3 weeks over the course of a year. And then we're going to be talking to our participants about which they think was most important, and also looking at which things that the toolkit seemed to have most impact on. We're also looking at some child-based measures. So we go in and we do questionnaires with the children in school about how they feel about school and what their quality of life is. And then parents are kind of reporting on what other services they use to support their child, so that we can calculate essentially what the cost is of having ADHD or high traits of ADHD, in terms of, how many GP appointments do you have? Are you involved with social care? How many visits do you have from different people? And see whether using the toolkit changes any of that for them. And then we're obviously interested in how this impacts on teachers. So teachers are filling in questionnaires about their own well-being and how they feel about work and their job. We're also observing children in the classroom, and I have a PhD student whose whole PhD is around validating one of these observational measures of behaviour as well. And then we're collecting qualitative data. So everything in this table is kind of questionnaire or quantitative data. But we're also doing focus groups and interviews with everyone who's involved to find out more about how they're using the toolkit, what they're using, what changes we should make, and also what they think the impacts are. We're also measuring any negative impacts that we think might happen, or that people tell us are happening, because we don't think it's necessarily always all positive. So it might be that a child feels singled out or isolated, and that might be more detrimental than not using the toolkit at all. So to establish whether or not I've met my aims at the end of the 5 years and it is feasible and acceptable, I have this thing called continuation criteria, which is basically a table of percentages. So we're tracking kind of who's doing what in the toolkit, and then also who's doing what in terms of what we're asking them to do for the research side of assessing the toolkit. And then we have these kind of traffic light criteria where if we meet the green criteria, then it means go for it. Let's do a full trial and see if this is effective. If it's orange, we're going to think, okay, well, we're doing something wrong here. Not enough people are doing this to make it worthwhile. So is it that we need to change the questionnaire we're asking people? Do we need to change the way that the training is formatted? Or are there other reasons that this isn't quite going as planned? And then if we're in the kind of red range, we're thinking, okay, there's something seriously wrong with the way that we're designing the toolkit or the research process around it, and we need to redesign it. So that's how you assess whether something like this is feasible or acceptable. It's a few years off now, though. So overall, we've got one of the protocols for the study for the evidence synthesis published, and the other one for the actual feasibility study has just been revised. We've alpha tested the prototype, which means that my planning group have all had a really good chance to play with it and tell me exactly what they think is wrong with it and make those changes. And it's going out to schools in a couple of weeks. And then we're just testing, refining, adapting and repeating that process for a couple of years. And I also have to write up the first 3 papers from this work to publish in journals as well. So if it does all go to plan, in the future, we'll be doing a grant application for a cluster randomized control trial. So that's where you recruit schools as units of participation rather than children. So in a normal randomized control trial, you kind of maybe recruit 10 children and allocate each one of them to having a treatment or not having a treatment. But when you're assessing something like a school-based intervention, if you were to give different children in the same school the toolkit or not the toolkit, their teachers might talk to each other or they might pick up tricks. So the toolkit wouldn't necessarily just affect the one child who was meant to get the intervention. So instead, we would have one school where everyone gets the toolkit and another school where nobody gets the toolkit to compare them with. And then I also think that this kind of low-cost school-led intervention could be useful for other kind of common mental health and neurodevelopmental traits. So I'm thinking about applying for a program grant, so where I'm using the same method but targeting some other different traits. So if anyone's got any ideas about what that should target, then do let me know. So I think that's me finished. I normally have a lot of like extra slides, so I'm going to stop sharing so that I don't embarrassingly show you all the things that I decided not to include.
Thank you, Abby. That was a great talk. It was really interesting to see like just how many stages you've gone through towards designing this intervention. And I think so many schools wanting to participate is testament to how useful and needed this kind of support is for teachers. So I'll open Abby up to questions now. If you guys want to unmute yourselves or put questions in the chat, then go ahead. And while people have a chance to think, I will start with a question. So I was just wondering how you selected the activities for each of the different targets. Are they sort of evidence-based things that have been used in other studies, or were some of them things that you had to design yourself?
Yeah, when I first started this, I thought, oh, people will have done this already. I can just, get copyright permissions for what other people have done. But actually, most of it has been designed by me and my team. So what we've done is we've taken the behavior change techniques that we know will help, and we've looked at other evidence of other interventions and the kind of things that they've done. And then we've worked with our school staff and parents to think about what kind of activity could you do in the classroom that would use these kind of principles and achieve these kind of changes. So that's how we've done it. It's been a very creative process. I've had to come up with a lot of silly names for strategies, which I think has been one of my favorite things. Yeah.
Yeah, there were some catchy names in there. Do we have any questions from the audience for Abby?
Hello. Oh, sorry. Hello, can you hear me okay? Hello. Thank you very much. It was really interesting and really enjoyed it. And I was particularly interested in the thinking about positives element, because so much of the literature seems to be focused on the difficulties and less on leveraging the positives. And I wondered whether your review maybe, or your systematic review had highlighted work on positives and leveraging positives in ADHD. If so, I'd love to be able to read your literature review because I've really struggled to find that literature. And then how do you see it play out with your expert panels? I mean, what are their insights, maybe qualitative insights on the positives and how they want to use them?
So it's all come from this outcome of self-esteem. So when Roisin did her study, which was quite a few years ago now, self-esteem wasn't something that had been measured in any ADHD studies, and it was something that people actually put forward as something we should have on our list of potential measures, and then it was voted for as one of the top ones. So you're right, there's very little research evidence out there around self-esteem and ADHD, and the importance of positives, but there is stuff around the importance of positive feedback for learning. So we've taken that evidence. So in my systematic review, there will be a big gap. There's a few trials around self-esteem, but they're not specific to ADHD. I think one of the main things that kind of really motivated me to do that was this kind of cycle of negative communication between home and school, where it's always about the problems that have happened during the day, and then hearing from children and adolescents kind of how that builds up and affects them over time. And I think it leads to things like school avoidance and school refusal, because it's just such a negative place to be. So the other kind of aspect that comes into it is strengths-based coaching skills. So we use this with adults, where you think about what are your strengths and leveraging those, rather than trying to kind of overcome the things that you're not so good at. You actually think about, okay, well, what am I good at and how can I use that in a positive way? So some of the influences are from the kind of strengths-based coaching model. With your second question, so how did it play out with my expert panels? Well, I found out they're very detail oriented. So I got a whole list of spelling mistakes and I got some kind of, well, when I click this link and then I click back 3 times, it crashes the website. So no, that wasn't all like that, actually. No, it was really helpful. So there was stuff like the school home notebook was originally, you could access it just within a child's toolkit, but now it's also on the home page, so you can choose which child's notebook you go to make that more prominent. So things like that, and also having some of the strategies in multiple modules rather than just one strategy in each module. Although one of my parents who has ADHD, who has a son with ADHD, was saying to me, you know, it's great, but I think all the strategies should be in all the modules. I don't think that's quite going to work, but yeah, so that's been really helpful, and they've also helped with kind of the design and layout and thinking about the length of the learning snippets and what the really key information is. So I didn't have a video originally around sensory processing, and now I've got one that's quite detailed around sensory processing and what kind of behaviours that can look like in the classroom if you're kind of hyper or hyposensitive to different things. So yeah.
Thank you. We've got a few questions in the chat. Javiera says, hi, Abby, thanks for this amazing presentation. I just wonder if you have thought about the time teachers will need in their daily practice to perform the strategies. I have conducted research on school-based interventions, and normally the availability of time is one of the barriers to conduct new strategies.
Totally agree. I have thought about it, and it's a big part of the kind of the work I did even when I was applying for funding, was talking to teachers about, is this something that you're going to be able to do at all, and what would motivate you to do it? And most of the teachers have come back and said, well, I think actually overall it would save me time, because I spend so much time trying to manage the classroom that if I had some extra tips and tricks that I could just pick out and use, then that might save me time. So it remains to be seen whether it actually does. I think the other thing that's really important about this is designing a lot of it as group-based or whole classroom-based activities. So the Know Me activity actually dovetails with what a lot of schools do at the beginning of the school year in terms of teachers getting to know their new students. And a lot of the activities and lessons we've designed fit into kind of science lessons or geography lessons or other topics that they'll be teaching anyway. So we're hoping that they'll be able to think, okay, well, actually, I could do that next Tuesday during science. So it'll be really interesting to see what they say. Yeah.
Relatedly, Rachel says in the chat, are you addressing a need that teachers have already, and so you aren't actually increasing their workload?
I mean, hopefully, yes, that's how the project came about. Was teachers, when I did my qualitative research during my PhD, I did focus groups in 12 different schools, and teachers were saying, you know, this is a real problem for us. We know that we need to manage these children better, but all the stuff we know how to do just doesn't work with these kids. So yeah, hopefully that's what we're doing. I'll be able to come back in a couple of years and tell you whether I was right or wrong.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, that would be great. People are asking if there'll be updates on the development and the impact of the work. So.
Yeah, so we have like an informal website, which is, I can put it in the chat, but it's blogs.exeter.ac.uk /tools for schools. And then the actual toolkit, when it goes live in a couple of weeks, will be, I think it's toolsforschools.info will be the web address for it. But that will be linked to from our blog site. So if you were to Google me at the University of Exeter, you'd be able to find it all fairly straightforward. Yeah.
Brilliant. We've got a question from Maria. She says, this project is so cool. How did you develop the website? Did you have to hire someone external for that?
Great question. When I was applying for funding, I asked someone who's one of my academic advisors who's done a parenting app, how much did it cost? And he gave me a number that was probably a 2 years salary for me. And I thought, oh, they're never going to give me that much money. So I am working with someone in research IT at my university. So I did some courses on HTML and CSS, which are kind of basic web design courses. And then I've written all the content and the text and done all the design. And then my research IT compatriot, Ian, is making sure that it's all GDPR secure, and he's building all the interactive components like the school home notebook, and we've got some quizzes on there and things. So he's he's an internal person at the university, and having worked on other projects with kind of external companies developing this stuff, it's much more cost effective the way that we've done it. So the whole prototype is costing less than £10,000 to put together.
Oh, brilliant. Wow. Question from Danielle. Oh, actually more of a comment. Hi, Abby. I think a version of this for autism spectrum disorder would be brilliant. In CAMS and child health, we can't intervene specifically for ASD because we're often only commissioned for assessment and diagnosis. Yeah, that's a really important point. And actually, I was meeting with someone in CAMS in Torbay the other week, and they were saying, well, could we use this kind of thing as our early response in terms of, can we signpost schools and families to this rather than kind of diagnosing them and sending them away disappointed because there's nothing else we can do. So yeah, I do know that the Scottish government have a really good autism toolkit online, actually, that I think is brilliant. So if you do need an autism toolkit at the moment. Would you be able to link to that in the chat for us, Abby? Yeah, I'm sure I can find it. Rachel asks, would you be willing to share your slides? Because I think there's so much that would be helpful across other settings. Absolutely, I would. Yeah, no problem. Should I just send them to you afterwards? Yeah, thank you. And I can send them up. Do we have any further questions from the audience? I'll put my website in there as well, so if people want updates, they can. Thank you.
Oh, I had a question. I've just thought of a question. Abby, sorry. This actually came from a young person with ADHD who approached me to ask whether there are programs a bit like yours, but for secondary school kids. I mean, you're quite rightly, you're intervening in primary, which is brilliant. But maybe are there already some similar approaches that work for secondaries?
So I don't know of any offhand, but I do know, so the ADHD Foundation, who are a charity based in Liverpool, they have a huge amount of online resources, and a lot of their resources are targeted more towards adolescents and teenagers. And then the other place is the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health have recently released, I think, 4 podcasts about kind of growing up with ADHD, which are again more targeted towards teenagers. So I've been looking at them for my toolkit and then thinking, oh damn, these targeted at children who are older than I'm targeting, but would be probably really helpful for teenagers. But I don't know of anything similar to what I'm doing in a teenage population.
Rachel, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wondered if, so girls and women are usually underdiagnosed and they don't exhibit the same traits or obvious traits, very good at masking. So I just wondered if you kind of factored that in or what you're doing to address that, because otherwise it seems to be very skewed towards young boys who get noticed, or their behaviours are the ones that get noticed.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So every school that participates, we are part of the criteria are that we're recruiting at least one girl in every school, and we're having kind of explicit conversations with schools about what these girls might look like and how they might not appear like the really bouncy boys that they immediately jump to. And actually in one school we've got 3 girls recruited and 1 boy. So I think it's more about awareness generally. And I also, so I'm not specifically doing anything around ADHD in girls, but I have colleagues in Exeter in psychology who are, and I also know there's a few PhD students in the UK at the moment as well who are working on kind of ADHD in women and ADHD in girls. So I think in the next few years, we're going to see a lot more awareness. And there's, yeah, so there is stuff coming and people are starting to pay attention to it, but it's not something that I'm specifically tackling with my work, I'd say.
Okay, thank you.
Right, I think let's close the session for today. Thank you so much, Abby, for a really interesting talk, and thanks everyone for a great discussion. I look forward to seeing the results from your pilot. Yeah, hopefully you'll come back and talk to us again when you're further along with the project.
Definitely, I love talking about it, so I'd be delighted. Thanks for inviting me.
Great, thank you.